Rain hammered the mansion roof, as marble breathed cold and clean. Then the shot carved the night open, and the world stalled. Alex Mercer said. Silence lies, while a body slumped across the stair, crimson threading the stone. Vincent Morella's ring clicked on each step as his hand slid away from the phone. Alex Mercer said, breathe, count, move, and the air tasted like metal and old money. Lightning framed the corridors, and gates hissed shut like jaws. Alex Mercer said, someone wanted witnesses to vanish, and shadows pooled under chandeliers. A final text glowed on the screen. It's done. The king is dead. Alex Mercer said, not like this, and pocketed the phone as thunder rolled. Boots scuffed in a distant hall, deliberate and patient. Alex Mercer said, clock the exits, and the portraits seemed to watch and accuse. The mansion exhaled, and the empire shifted on its broken hinge. Alex Mercer said, he was supposed to outlive us all, while the chandelier hummed like a hive above the blood. The text on the phone burned a hole through the night, and guilt folded in tight behind his ribs. Alex Mercer said, no panic, no prince, and wiped the glass with practiced grace. The storm pressed the windows flat, and the portraits peered down as judges. Alex Mercer said, if this is a coup, it's a choir, and listened for second shooters. A soft clatter answered from the east wing, patient as a hunter's breath. Alex Mercer said, they want me to run, and he forced his steps to be slow. The ring on the stair gleamed like a lighthouse over wreckage. Alex Mercer said, I'll take your last words, old man, and save the message. Somewhere, a lock cycled, and the mansion smiled with teeth. Footfalls rolled from the gallery, measured and sure, and the air tightened like a noose. Alex Mercer said, you're late, Petrov, and slipped into the mezzanine's shadow. The line to Marco Reyes clicked alive, brittle as ice. Marco Reyes said, tell me you're not there, as static stitched his words. Alex Mercer said, he's down and it isn't mine, and watched the gallery doors breathe. Marco Reyes said, then you're the bait, and a soft curse rode the thunder. Alex Mercer said, I'll set the hook, and muted the call as a silhouette filled the hall. The weight of old favors pressed on his spine. Alex Mercer said, come on, ghost, and the storm answered with teeth on glass. The study door yielded to a gentle push, and dust rose like old confessions. Alex Mercer said, you kept the good saints close, and eyed the saintly portrait guarding the safe. The frame lifted, and a dial kissed the light with brass. Alex Mercer said, left 12, right 7, and memory found the rhythm of past sins. Inside lay a ledger, a flash drive, and a framed smile from a life that didn't bleed. Maya Collins said, you promised a clean dawn from the ghost of his conscience. Alex Mercer said, I'm trying, as sirens smudged the distance into bruise blue. Paper smelled like rain and smoke. Alex Mercer said, this ends with sunlight or fire, and slipped the drive into his pocket. Garden lights pulsed behind rain like distant lighthouses, and the gravel breathed under idling tires. Alex Mercer said, gate 3 is blind for 8 seconds, and counted with the thunder. A black sedan watched the drive like a pupil. Emma Mercer said, you always arrive after the storm, as she stepped beneath an umbrella near the wrought iron arch. Alex Mercer said, family shouldn't be here, and folded into hedges that smelled like cut copper. Emma Mercer said, someone killed a legacy, and her voice wore no grief. Alex Mercer said, then someone will sell the pieces, and a siren grew teeth on the hill. The umbrella turned, and her eyes were mirrors. Alex Mercer said, not tonight, and the gate unlocked with a sigh. The safe house creaked as dawn dragged its gray feet across the windows. Alex Mercer said, you always hated mornings, and pinned a photo above the ledger. The flash drive winked like a patient fuse. Alex Mercer said, he kept saints and sins in the same drawer, and mapped roots in red thread. Old debts thrummed in the walls like caged bees. Alex Mercer said, if Petrov moves, he moves for someone richer, and circled the docks. A memory pressed his lungs flat, and left salt on his tongue. Alex Mercer said, Maya, I am not backing out, and the rune shrank to his hand on the phone. The message glared back with quiet fire. Alex Mercer said, "Find the cellar of a dead king, and close the blinds on the storm." The motel bathroom smelled like bleach and old thunder. Alex Mercer said, "No blood, no past," and rinsed the night from his cuffs. The mirror served him a stranger with careful eyes. Marco Reyes said, "Tell me you ghosted the cameras," over a hiss of static. Alex Mercer said, "I left them a sermon of nothing," and dried his hands with a stolen towel. Sirens faded toward the river and took a piece of him with them. Marco Reyes said, "Petrov is pulling muscle from the shipyards," and the phone trembled. Alex Mercer said, "Then the ledger points seaward," and pocketed the drive. The mirror kept his secrets and cracked the light into knives. The diner's neon pulsed like a wounded artery on the empty block. Alex Mercer said, "You chose a stage with windows and slid into the corner booth." Marco Reyes said, "I chose exits and set down coffee that smelled like rust." Alex Mercer said, "Petrov is a blade, not a brain," and unfolded a crude map. Marco Reyes said, "Then someone buys his edge by the pound," and pointed at the docks. Traffic hissed like snakes beyond the glass. Alex Mercer said, "The ledger ties shipments to a shell," and tapped the drive. Marco Reyes said, "You want proof or victory?" and his eyes did not blink. Alex Mercer said, "I want them to choke on both," and the neon bled across the table. The parking garage stacked shadows like debts no one paid. Negan. Alex Mercer said, "You were never subtle," as footsteps scraped concrete behind him. Ilya Petrov said, "Subtlety is for poets," and the echo smiled. Alex Mercer said, "You cleaned a throne with explosives," and kept his palms open. Ilya Petrov said, "I clean what I am told." And the words weighed a ton. The overhead lights flickered like condemned stars. "Oh?" Alex Mercer said, "Who bought your hours?" and tasted rubber and dust. Ilya Petrov said, "A widow, or a prince, or a priest," and moved one step closer. Alex Mercer said, "Then I will start with the one who prays," and the elevator dinged like a bell. The rooftop caught the first thread of daylight and stitched it across the city. Emma Mercer said, "You look like a man who lost a country," and closed her umbrella. Alex Mercer said, "I lost a map," and watched steam climb from vents. Emma Mercer said, "You kept the drive," and her voice balanced on wire. Alex Mercer said, "It holds a name that buys storms," and slid it into his coat. A distant siren rose and fell, like a warning swallowed whole. Emma Mercer said, "You could trade it for a life," and brushed rain from her sleeve. Alex Mercer said, "I already traded one," and the horizon reddened. Emma Mercer said, "Then choose the fire you can live with," and the city exhaled. The docks reeked of diesel and salt as cranes moaned against the breaking day. Alex Mercer said, "Every empire bleeds through its harbor," and marked the shipyard gates. Marco Reyes said, "Petrov rents muscle, not loyalty," and kept his pistol low. Alex Mercer said, "Then loyalty is the rarest cargo," and studied the freight containers stacked like tombs. A gull screamed as a truck rumbled closer, tires sloshing in brackish puddles. Marco Reyes said, "This ledger points to the Adriatic, not Jersey," and pointed at the cereals. Alex Mercer said, "Then the rot is global," and traced the shipping marks. Steel doors banged like gongs, and shadows shifted behind the crates. Alex Mercer said, "We're walking into someone else's sermon," and the water answered with black ripples. The warehouse air was thick with dust and old rope. Alex Mercer said, "He used this place for saints and smugglers," and dragged his hand across a crate stamped with false seals. Emma Mercer said, "Or ghosts," and her heels tapped the silence. Alex Mercer said, "Why follow me here?" and searched her eyes like riddles. Emma Mercer said, "Because family bleeds first," and her voice scraped like glass. The rafters creaked above as a rat darted across beams. Alex Mercer said, "Petrov owns the steel, but not the truth," and pried open the crate. Inside lay counterfeit passports and bricks of cash wrapped like scripture. Emma Mercer said, "Then truth is currency," and the wind slammed the door shut like judgment. The alley behind the docks was slick with oil and betrayal. Marco Reyes said, "You never told me she was blood," and lit a cigarette that hissed in drizzle. Alex Mercer said, "She was blood long before she was blade," and pocketed the lighter. Marco Reyes said, "That changes the math," and blew smoke like confession. Alex Mercer said, "Math never saves lives, only measures loss," and leaned against brick. Sirens whispered in the distance, muffled by rain. Marco Reyes said, "Petrov will know before noon," and crushed the cigarette under boot. Alex Mercer said, "Then noon is the graveyard bell," and his eyes hardened like steel. The alley swallowed their silence. The church smelled of wax and mildew, its pews empty but for shadows. Alex Mercer said, "You always chose sanctuaries for your trades," and sat near the altar. Ilya Petrov said, "Only fools trust walls," and stepped from the side aisle. Alex Mercer said, "You serve ghosts and gold alike," and slid the ledger forward. Ilya Petrov said, "Gold outlives ghosts," and touched the worn wood. The stained glass filtered light into fractured blues. Alex Mercer said, "Tell me who buys your hours," and his voice shook. Ilya Petrov said, "You already share their blood," and the silence bled across the stones. Thunder rattled the roof, and the candle flames quivered. The pier stretched like a scar into black water. Emma Mercer said, "You let Petrov walk," and her tone cracked like ice. Alex Mercer said, "I needed his silence, not his corpse," and leaned against the railing. Emma Mercer said, "You mistake silence for mercy," and her eyes cut through him. Alex Mercer said, "Mercy has no ledger entry," and dropped a cigarette into the tide. The water carried it like a funeral boat. Emma Mercer said, "The family will burn your name for this," and pulled her coat tighter. Alex Mercer said, "Then let them burn," and the horizon bled orange with dawn. The pier groaned, waiting for collapse. The penthouse windows bled neon over a skyline drowning in rain. Alex Mercer said, "You picked a palace for a confession," and paced the glass wall. Emma Mercer said, "Truth deserves a view," and poured wine into crystal. Alex Mercer said, "Truth buys coffins, not comfort," and unbuttoned his damp coat. Emma Mercer said, "You chased shadows, Alex, but I lit the fire," and her tone carved deep. The thunder rolled like a verdict across steel towers. Alex Mercer said, "You tore the family apart," and his voice trembled. Emma Mercer said, "I freed us from chains," and her glass trembled too. Silence grew sharp, and betrayal walked the room in bare feet. The glass cracked beneath her words, invisible but loud. Alex Mercer said, "You killed him, didn't you?" and pressed his hand flat against the window. Emma Mercer said, "He crowned himself untouchable," and her smile was ash. Alex Mercer said, "He was still our blood," and his breath fogged the pain. Emma Mercer said, "Blood is just water painted red," and her eyes flicked like knives. The city sirens howled far below. Alex Mercer said, "You worked with Petrov," and the wine spilled dark on the rug. Emma Mercer said, "Petrov was only the gatekeeper," and she whispered, "You never saw the true masters." The neon pulsed, and the world bent around the truth. The elevator groaned up the shaft, carrying answers like loaded dice. Marco Reyes said, "You both kept me blind," as the doors parted with a sigh. Alex Mercer said, "She was the ghost in every room," and stepped back. Emma Mercer said, "Marco, you played the pawn," and her voice dripped contempt. Marco Reyes said, "Then call me pawn with teeth," and unholstered cold steel. Alex Mercer said, "No one leaves untouched tonight," and drew his breath steady. Emma Mercer said, "I already left the family in ruins," and spread her arms wide. The air smelled of ozone and blood not yet spilled. The storm punched glass with fists of water as lightning painted scars across the room. Alex Mercer said, "This empire was built on his bones," and leveled his gaze at Emma. Emma Mercer said, and I shattered it before it swallowed us whole, her voice unyielding. Marco Reyes said, "Don't make me choose between you," and his hands shook. Alex Mercer said, "Choice was stolen the moment she pulled the trigger, and the truth clawed out." Emma Mercer said, "You think too small, brother," and her smile burned hollow. The thunder cracked, and the city seemed to bow in silence. Betrayal tasted like iron and rain. The city pulsed below, unaware its kings and traitors battled in silence. Alex Mercer said, "Name the hand that fed you," and his voice was steel. Emma Mercer said, "Politicians, generals, bankers," and she laughed like broken glass. Marco Reyes said, "Global cartels pulling strings," and the weight bent his spine. Alex Mercer said, "We were pawns in a war of shadows," and the words burned. Emma Mercer said, "I chose to be queen," and her locket gleamed like a scar. Alex Mercer said, "Then queens fall hardest," and the storms swallowed the last of their family bond. The skyline swallowed their war cry. The train yard sprawled like a graveyard of iron bones. Enthusiastic. Alex Mercer said, "Every shipment is a heartbeat," and traced the ledger with his finger. Marco Reyes said, "Petrov hides his secrets in steel," and nodded toward the sealed containers. Alex Mercer said, "Secrets rot when the sun hits them," and his breath fogged the cold morning air. Emma Mercer said, "You think daylight changes anything?" and her tone snapped like a whip. The screech of brakes split the silence as a train rumbled through. Alex Mercer said, "Daylight burns lies into ash," and shouldered his pistol. The shadows beneath the cars whispered of ambush, and betrayal waited with patient teeth. The container groaned as its seal cracked, dust spilling like secrets. Alex Mercer said, "He moved weapons under grain shipments," and lifted the tarp. Marco Reyes said, "Enough rifles to arm a nation," and his voice was low. Emma Mercer said, "Or topple one," and she smiled without warmth. Alex Mercer said, "This ledger ties to capitals, not corners," and snapped photos. Marco Reyes said, "Politicians feast while soldiers bleed," and spat on the concrete. Alex Mercer said, "The rot runs higher than I feared," and shoved the ledger into his coat. The clatter of boots rang through the yard like an alarm. The ambush sang in the crack of rifles. Alex Mercer said, "Down," and slammed Marco behind a crate. Emma Mercer said, "You led them here," and her eyes cut like glass. Alex Mercer said, "I led myself here," and drew steel with steady hands. Bullets tore sparks from metal and shredded mist. Marco Reyes said, "We're boxed in," and gritted his teeth. Alex Mercer said, "Then we carved the box open and fired back into shadows." The yard filled with thunder, smoke, and betrayal. Emma Mercer said, "Every bullet is proof," and slipped toward the far track. The ground shook as another train screamed past, swallowing their wall. The smoke thinned, leaving silence sharp as glass. Alex Mercer said, "They wanted us erased, not tested," and kicked a shell aside. Marco Reyes said, "Petrov won't be the head on this board," and wiped blood from his sleeve. Alex Mercer said, "He's another piece," and scanned the skyline. Emma Mercer said, "Pieces make patterns," and her locket gleamed in gray light. Alex Mercer said, "Patterns paint gods behind curtains," and his fists clenched. Marco Reyes said, "Then we tear the curtain," and his eyes hardened. Alex Mercer said, "No, we burn it," and the rising sun bled across the steel. Their war was no longer in shadows, but in the open air. The bridge arched over the river like a vein of steel. Alex Mercer said, "We stand on fault lines," and stared into the current. Emma Mercer said, "Fault lines bring change," and her voice held no fear. Marco Reyes said, "Fault lines swallow everyone," and leaned against the railing. Alex Mercer said, "The ledger shows a summit, elites circling like vultures," and tapped the drive. Emma Mercer said, "That's where the throne is sold," and her eyes burned. Alex Mercer said, "Then we crashed their auction," and the river thundered below. Marco Reyes said, "And if it costs us everything," and his voice trembled. Alex Mercer said, "Then everything is the price," and the city lights flickered awake. The estate rose above the cliffs like a predator watching the sea, its windows blazing against the storm. Alex Mercer said, "He hides in palaces, not trenches," and his breath clouded the cold night. Marco Reyes said Sebastian Vale is 2 steps ahead, and chambered around. Emma Mercer said, and 10 steps deeper, her voice brittle with secrets. The gates groaned open, as if welcoming judgment. Alex Mercer said, "Every empire ends at its own door," and tightened his grip on the flash drive. Thunder roared, shaking chandeliers through the glass. Emma Mercer said, "This is not a siege, it's a trial," and her locket gleamed faintly. Alex Mercer said, "Then let's pass sentence," and the storm swallowed their approach with shadows. The grand hall yawned with marble and silence, broken only by dripping rain. Sebastian Vale said, "Welcome home, Alex," his voice smooth as glass. Alex Mercer said, "Home was buried with him," and stepped across the polished floor. Emma Mercer said, "Don't pretend you didn't want this," and her eyes searched Vale. Sebastian Vale said, "I wanted inevitability," and his hands rested on a cane tipped with gold. Marco Reyes said, "You puppeteered Petrov, didn't you?" and raised his pistol. Sebastian Vale said, "Puppets dance for strings, not honor," and his smile froze. Alex Mercer said, "Then tonight, the strings burn and the storm cracked through broken windows." Shadows deepened, whispering violence yet to come. The study smelled of leather and old fire, its shelves stacked with secrets. Sebastian Vale said, "This empire doesn't fall, it adapts," and poured whiskey into crystal. Alex Mercer said, "Adaptation is just decay in disguise," and circled the desk. Emma Mercer said, "You promised me freedom," and her words cracked. Sebastian Vale said, "And I gave you a crown," and he touched her shoulder. Marco Reyes said, "Crowns weigh heavier than chains," and aimed steady. Alex Mercer said, "Your reign ends with exposure," and he set the flash drive on the desk. Sebastian Vale said, "Exposure without survival is nothing," and his hand closed on a hidden pistol. The room tightened, ready to explode with choices. Gunfire shattered portraits as smoke curled like ghosts. Alex Mercer said, "This is your legacy, Vale, dust and ashes, and dove behind the desk." Sebastian Vale said, "Legacy is fear carved into time, and fired with ruthless calm." Marco Reyes said, "We end him now," and flanked left. Emma Mercer said, "Stop, you'll kill us all," her voice breaking as bullets sparked stone. Alex Mercer said, "You already chose your side," and his words struck her harder than lead. Sebastian Vale said, "She chose survival," and reloaded smoothly. Marco Reyes said, "Survival dies tonight," and surged forward. Alex Mercer said, "Not survival, truth," and fired into the storm-lit chaos. The estate groaned under the weight of betrayal and fire. The balcony roared with wind and rain as the storm climaxed above the sea. Sebastian Vale said, "Kill me and you inherit my throne," and spread his arms. Alex Mercer said, "I want no throne," and leveled his pistol. Emma Mercer said, "Then destroy the empire," and her voice broke into rain. Marco Reyes said, "The drive is the weapon," and held it aloft. Sebastian Vale said, "Without me, you're nothing," and his eyes blazed. Alex Mercer said, "Without you, I'm free," and the storm silenced them. The choice hung like lightning, ready to split sky and soul. Alex Mercer said, "Truth or revenge," and his finger hovered. The empire trembled on the edge of extinction. The estate smoldered as dawn cracked the storm apart. Alex Mercer said, "The world will choke on the truth," and tossed the drive to Marco. Marco Reyes said, "And drown in its cost," his eyes hollow. Emma Mercer said, "Family dies in silence," and turned away. The smoke curled into heaven like prayers denied. Alex Mercer said, "There's no family left, only ashes," and stepped into the light. The sea hissed below, carrying whispers of the dead. The pier groaned under their steps, as gulls screamed overhead. Marco Reyes said, "You burned every bridge and flicked ash into the tide." Alex Mercer said, "Bridges were traps," and leaned on the railing. Emma Mercer said, "Then you walk alone," her words sharp. Alex Mercer said, "Alone is safer than chained," and his gaze cut across the water. The river shimmered with broken light, carrying away empires and regrets. The diner was half empty, its neon buzz weak in daylight. Alex Mercer said, "Every lie costs a life," and pushed coffee aside. Marco Reyes said, "And truth costs more," his voice cracked. Emma Mercer said, "Then what's left?" and her hands shook. Alex Mercer said, "Survival," and the word cut dry. The jukebox wheezed a broken tune as silence claimed the booth. The war was over, but the scars had only begun to sing. The cemetery whispered with the weight of names carved in stone. Alex Mercer said, "Every war ends here," and laid a flower. Emma Mercer said, "Names fade faster than blood," and her voice cracked. Marco Reyes said, "At least blood dries," and his hands clenched. Alex Mercer said, "Not mine," and his shadow fell across the grave. The wind carried silence heavy as lead, and the world spun without kings. Night returned, heavy with rain, as Alex Mercer walked alone down an empty street. Alex Mercer said, "The empire is gone, but ghosts keep marching," and his eyes were hollow. A phone rang in the distance, echoing through alleys. Alex Mercer said, "The war never ends, it only shifts," and his shadow vanished into the dark. The city swallowed him whole, leaving silence for the dead and fear for the living.